When we talk about the collapse of Russia's 41st Army near Pokrovsk, we are not talking about a minor setback or a fleeting embarrassment on the battlefield. We are talking about a systemic, catastrophic failure that has stunned military analysts and observers alike. The reports still being confirmed suggest that approximately 25,000 soldiers were killed in an operation that, on the surface, seemed intended to achieve a breakthrough, but instead ended in near total annihilation. Pause for a moment on that number, 25,000. To put it into perspective, that is more than some entire divisions in previous conflicts, wiped out in what can only be described as an operational disaster. The sheer scale forces us to ask the most fundamental questions. How does an army, one of the so-called pillars of Russian military power, simply disintegrate under fire? And what does this reveal about the strategic, logistical, and human dimensions of the war? The details emerging from the field paint a picture of confusion, miscommunication, and miscalculation at every level. Soldiers report being sent into terrain that was inadequately scouted, with intelligence that was outdated or outright misleading. Command structures appear to have failed in relaying critical orders, leaving units exposed and uncoordinated. When formations move forward without clarity, the result is predictable. Chaos multiplies exponentially, and what should have been a calculated maneuver devolves into a rout. This is not the story of individual bravery or heroism. It is the story of institutional failure writ large, where planning, logistics, and leadership all collide to produce catastrophic loss. What makes this collapse particularly striking is the element of preventability. According to analysts, there were warning signs at almost every stage: insufficient artillery support, inadequate reserves, poor reconnaissance, and even dissenting voices from within the command structure urging caution. Yet the assault went forward. The term ridiculous is being used by insiders and observers alike, not as exaggeration, but as a sober assessment of a military gamble that went horrifically wrong. When tens of thousands of lives are risked in a single operation, the stakes are immense and the costs are irrevocable. Beyond numbers and strategy, there is a profound human dimension. Every casualty represents a life lost, a family shattered, and a community in mourning. The soldiers of the 41st Army were not abstractions. They were fathers, sons, and brothers, people who were sent into what appears to have been a hopeless endeavor. The psychological toll on survivors, if any, will be immense. And the social and political repercussions within Russia are already beginning to ripple outward. Questions about leadership competence, the integrity of military planning, and the overall direction of the campaign are no longer theoretical. They are urgent, pressing, and unavoidable. The collapse also carries broader implications for the perception of Russian military strength on the international stage. For years, Moscow has projected power and deterrence, showcasing a force that was disciplined, well-equipped, and formidable. The 41st Army's collapse challenges that image dramatically. Allies and adversaries alike are taking note, recalculating assumptions about Russia's operational capabilities. The battlefield has become a stark mirror, reflecting not just tactical failure, but the fragility of the systems underpinning Russian military operations. In short, the destruction of the 41st Army is a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition outpaces preparation, when political imperatives override military prudence, and when human cost is subordinated to strategic misjudgment. It is a moment that demands scrutiny, reflection, and vigilance, not only for those analyzing the conflict from afar, but for the global community watching how modern warfare unfolds in real time. The echoes of this collapse are likely to be felt far beyond Pokrovsk, and the story is far from over. When examining the collapse of Russia's 41st Army near Pokrovsk, one of the most striking elements is the role of strategic miscalculation at the highest levels of command. This was not merely a battlefield error or a tactical misstep. It appears to have been a decision made in the upper echelons of Russian military leadership, one that ignored the clear realities on the ground. Intelligence reports indicate that warnings were issued prior to the offensive, signaling that the assault would face severe logistical challenges and strong Ukrainian defenses. Yet the operation went forward. This raises a crucial question. Why would a military leadership knowingly commit tens of thousands of soldiers to a highly vulnerable maneuver? The answer may lie less in strategy and more in political calculation, a dynamic that has long complicated Russian military campaigns. From multiple accounts, there seems to have been significant pressure from political leaders to demonstrate progress, regardless of battlefield conditions. Moscow's desire to project strength, both to domestic audiences and to the international community, may have driven commanders to launch an assault that they themselves knew was ill-prepared. The result was predictable. Units were under-supported, supplies were mismanaged, and the assault lacked the necessary artillery and reconnaissance coordination to succeed. What could have been a calculated engagement instead became a textbook example of hubris meeting reality on the battlefield. Observers have noted that when political imperatives dictate military action, the careful balance of planning, logistics, and timing often collapses, leaving the soldiers to bear the consequences. The collapse of the 41st Army also highlights systemic weaknesses within the Russian military structure. Analysts have pointed to a disconnect between strategic decision-making and operational execution. Commanders in the field often reported conflicting orders, outdated intelligence, and insufficient support. When an army's leadership is caught between following flawed strategic directives and responding to immediate tactical realities, cohesion disintegrates rapidly. The Pokrovsk offensive illustrates how high-level misjudgments reverberate downward, ultimately manifesting as chaos, mass casualties, and loss of morale. Another element that makes this miscalculation particularly consequential is the contrast between expectation and outcome. The Kremlin likely envisioned a decisive, confidence-boosting strike, one that would bolster Russia's narrative of strength and inevitability. Instead, the collapse of the 41st Army sent shockwaves not only through military ranks, but through the political establishment itself. Russian officials are now faced with the dual challenge of managing both the operational fallout and the domestic perception of failure. The political stakes of a single poorly planned offensive have magnified exponentially because they directly undermine the image of control that Moscow has sought to project for years. Beyond the immediate battlefield consequences, this strategic miscalculation also carries broader implications for the trajectory of the war. An assault that fails so spectacularly emboldens Ukrainian forces and signals vulnerabilities to NATO and other global observers. It demonstrates that even the most ostensibly formidable formations are susceptible to collapse when leadership overestimates capability and underestimates resistance. The ripple effects are profound. Morale, international perception, supply prioritization, and future operational planning are all influenced by the decisions made at the top in moments of pressure, hubris, or misjudgment. In essence, the Pokrovsk debacle underscores the dangers of political expediency overriding military prudence. It reminds us that in modern warfare, strategy is not just about numbers, firepower, or positioning. It is about timing, intelligence, coordination, and judgment. When these factors are ignored or compromised for political optics, the consequences are measured not just in lost territory, but in thousands of lives and shattered units, as the collapse of the 41st Army starkly demonstrates. The label ridiculous attached to Russia's assault near Pokrovsk is not mere hyperbole or sensationalism. It reflects the depth of tactical and operational misjudgment that observers are now piecing together. Reports from both battlefield analysts and insiders suggest that the offense is launched with a staggering lack of preparation. Reconnaissance, which is normally a critical precursor to any major military operation, appears to have been minimal or outdated. Ukrainian forces had anticipated the assault and positioned themselves strategically, while Russian units were moving into the field without the intelligence necessary to navigate terrain, enemy positions, and defensive fortifications. The result was a scenario where thousands of soldiers were exposed to concentrated fire without the means to maneuver effectively or respond dynamically to battlefield realities. The concept of a ridiculous assault is tied directly to the disconnect between the plan and its execution. Analysts have highlighted that artillery support was insufficient, logistical lines were overstretched, and coordination between units was inconsistent at best. Orders from command reportedly contradicted the conditions on the ground, leaving soldiers to improvise in a highly volatile environment. In modern warfare, the difference between a calculated risk and a catastrophic failure often hinges on preparation and support. In this case, both were glaringly absent. Observers note that calling the assault ridiculous is not an insult, but an objective assessment of how fundamentally flawed the operation was from conception to deployment. Adding to the absurdity, political pressure appears to have played a decisive role in the timing and scope of the attack. Moscow has long sought rapid, symbolic victories to maintain the perception of momentum in the conflict, and it seems that this operation was designed with optics in mind rather than battlefield logic. Units were reportedly thrown into a frontal engagement against entrenched Ukrainian positions with little margin for error. It is the kind of decision that, when successful, is celebrated as bold and decisive. But when it fails, as it did, it exposes the stark recklessness of the leadership's priorities. The human cost, tens of thousands of lives, is the clearest metric of how ill-conceived the operation was. The ridiculous nature of the assault also extends to broader questions about strategy and command culture. Observers note that dissenting voices within the Russian military hierarchy may have warned against the operation, highlighting deficiencies in intelligence, supply, and troop readiness. The fact that these warnings were reportedly ignored points to a systemic problem. When hierarchical pressure and political imperatives override operational expertise, the result is often disaster. The collapse of the 41st Army is a stark illustration of this principle in action, showing how strategic decision-making divorced from reality can produce catastrophic outcomes on the battlefield. Moreover, the psychological and symbolic impact cannot be underestimated. Labeling the assault ridiculous underscores the public perception of incompetence and mismanagement, both domestically and internationally. For Ukrainian forces, it provides a morale boost and validation of resistance. For Russian soldiers and commanders, it sows doubt and distrust, undermining cohesion and confidence. Internationally, the operation calls into question Russia's ability to conduct large-scale, disciplined military campaigns, affecting everything from diplomatic negotiations to future calculations of military power. The events at Pokrovsk demonstrate that war is not only measured in strategic objectives and territory gained, but in the alignment or misalignment of planning, intelligence, and execution. When that alignment fails so spectacularly, the term ridiculous becomes not exaggeration, but a factual description of an operation that defied logic and incurred devastating consequences. In this case, thousands of lives were lost in what can only be seen as a preventable, avoidable catastrophe, leaving analysts and policymakers alike grappling with the magnitude of the miscalculation and the lessons it imparts about leadership, strategy, and human cost. The collapse of Russia's 41st Army near Pokrovsk has not only shaken the battlefield, but has also sent reverberations through Moscow's military and political circle, exposing vulnerabilities at the very heart of Russia's command structure. Reports indicate that the destruction of such a significant formation has triggered intense internal scrutiny, with questions now emerging about accountability, competence, and the chain of command. The stakes could not be higher in a system where military prestige is deeply tied to political legitimacy. The failure of a single army-sized unit becomes more than a tactical loss. It becomes a crisis of credibility. Observers are noting that commanders who authorize the offensive may face investigations or reassignment. But the larger issue lies in the structural and systemic pressures that allowed such an operation to proceed despite clear warning signs. Evidence suggests that conflicting orders and poor communication within the Russian military hierarchy contributed directly to the disaster. Units reportedly received instructions that were inconsistent with the realities on the ground, leaving soldiers and junior commanders in a state of confusion at the very moment decisive action was required. This disconnect between planning and execution exposes a persistent tension between centralized decision-making and operational autonomy. In the Russian system, orders from the top are rarely questioned, even when local intelligence and field commanders signal danger. That rigidity, while historically intended to enforce discipline, can become catastrophic when the strategic judgment at the top is flawed. The political ramifications of the collapse are also significant. Moscow has invested heavily in projecting the image of a professional, capable military force. The sudden and catastrophic failure of the 41st Army undermines that narrative, creating a domestic propaganda challenge. Russian media outlets are tasked with framing the event carefully, downplaying casualties while maintaining the appearance of control. At the same time, nationalist commentators and pro-war voices have reportedly begun criticizing military leadership openly, highlighting tensions between loyalty to the state and the realities of battlefield outcomes. This internal friction amplifies the sense that the collapse is not merely an operational failure, but a structural and political dilemma with implications that extend far beyond Pokrovsk. The psychological impact on remaining Russian forces cannot be overstated. When an entire army is decimated, the trust between troops and command erodes. Soldiers may begin to question not only the competence of their leaders, but also the broader rationale for their deployment. Morale, which is already a critical factor in sustained military campaigns, becomes fragile when operations are perceived as reckless or politically driven. Analysts note that this erosion of confidence could hinder Russia's ability to regroup, reinforce, and launch future offensives, creating a ripple effect that extends across multiple fronts. Internationally, the collapse of the 41st Army has also drawn attention to Moscow's broader strategic vulnerabilities. Allies and adversaries alike are recalculating assumptions about Russia's operational effectiveness. If a force of this scale can be decimated due to poor planning and systemic weaknesses, it raises questions about Russia's capacity to conduct sustained conventional operations in other theaters. For policymakers and military strategists outside of Russia, this event is not just news. It is a case study in how structural flaws and political pressures converge to produce catastrophic outcomes, and it may influence everything from military aid to strategic alliances. The unraveling of the 41st Army highlights a central paradox. A military system designed for centralized control and disciplined obedience can achieve impressive results when leadership is competent. But it becomes extraordinarily fragile when those at the top miscalculate. The consequences of such miscalculations are now visible in Pokrovsk, in the ruins of an army and in the cascading political and organizational pressures that follow. The collapse of Russia's 41st Army near Pokrovsk has created what many analysts are calling a strategic opening for Ukraine, one that could shift the dynamics on the Eastern Front in ways that extend far beyond immediate territorial gains. Ukrainian forces, having witnessed the disintegration of a major Russian formation, now have the opportunity to exploit gaps in the defensive lines, reclaim lost territory, and potentially capture significant amounts of enemy equipment. The significance of such an opportunity cannot be overstated. In modern warfare, momentum is a critical factor. When one side falters on such a scale, the other is presented with a rare chance to not only advance militarily, but also to shape the broader narrative of the conflict. Reports from military analysts suggest that Ukrainian commanders are likely assessing how to translate this battlefield advantage into both tactical and psychological victories. The defeat of the 41st Army serves as both a practical and symbolic blow to Russian forces, signaling vulnerabilities in strategy, morale, and operational execution. For Ukrainian troops, witnessing a numerically and historically formidable opponent crumble can be profoundly motivating, reinforcing the belief that disciplined planning, preparation, and coordination can overcome larger or better equipped forces. The psychological impact on both sides is therefore immediate and potentially decisive, influencing decisions, morale, and willingness to engage in subsequent offensives. The operational implications for Ukraine also extend to logistics and strategic positioning. With Russian units in disarray, Ukrainian forces may have the opportunity to secure critical supply routes, fortify key positions, and isolate pockets of enemy troops. Such maneuvers are not only tactically advantageous, but also force Russian commanders into reactive strategies, compelling them to defend weak points rather than execute offensive plans. The collapse of the 41st Army, in this sense, creates a cascading effect. One failure leads to another, providing Ukraine with an increasingly favorable operational landscape that can be leveraged to achieve broader strategic objectives. The international dimension adds another layer of significance. Western allies providing military aid to Ukraine will likely interpret this victory as validation of their support, potentially encouraging continued or enhanced assistance, from intelligence sharing to the delivery of advanced weaponry. A visible and large-scale Russian failure strengthens Ukraine's position in the global arena, demonstrating the tangible impact of sustained support and coordinated military planning. This, in turn, it reinforces morale not only for Ukrainian forces, but also for policymakers and citizens in allied countries who are invested in the outcome of the conflict. At the same time, Ukrainian leadership faces the delicate task of balancing ambition with caution. Exploiting an enemy's weakness requires careful planning to avoid overextension, which could expose troops to counterattacks or logistical strain. Analysts emphasize that while the collapse of the 41st Army represents a historic tactical opportunity, the execution of follow-up operations must be precise. Missteps could diminish the advantage gained and allow Russian forces to regroup or stabilize weaker sectors. The fall of the 41st Army also carries symbolic weight. It demonstrates that even Russia's ostensibly formidable units are vulnerable to disciplined, strategically sound opposition. This sends a message not only to the battlefield, but also to the international community. Ukrainian forces are capable of challenging larger formations and achieving operational breakthroughs. Momentum, opportunity, and timing converge in this moment, offering Ukraine a platform from which to strengthen both military and diplomatic leverage in the ongoing conflict. Beyond military calculations and strategic maneuvers, the collapse of Russia's 41st Army near Pokrovsk underscores the profound human and political consequences of this conflict, consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. When reports indicate that approximately 25,000 soldiers were killed, the numbers themselves are staggering, but they are more than statistics. Each life lost represents families left grieving, communities destabilized, and a human toll that cannot be quantified in charts or maps. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and children now confront the stark reality of sudden absence, of promises and dreams cut short by a single military miscalculation. The human cost, while tragic in isolation, is amplified by the scale of the failure, turning personal grief into a broader social and political crisis that is likely to reverberate across Russia for months, if not years. Political implications are equally acute. The Kremlin, which has long relied on the projection of military competence as a pillar of domestic legitimacy, now faces an enormous credibility challenge. The destruction of an entire army-sized formation exposes vulnerabilities in leadership, planning, and decision-making, undermining the narrative of competence and control that Russian authorities have worked to cultivate. Within military circles, there are reportedly tensions and accusations, as senior commanders are questioned over the planning and execution of the Pokrovsk offensive. Beyond the chain of command, public perception is at stake. How will a government explain such a catastrophic loss without fueling dissent or eroding confidence among citizens already wary of prolonged conflict? The political calculus becomes as urgent and consequential as any battlefield maneuver. The collapse also highlights the strain of authoritarian decision-making in modern warfare. When orders are dictated from the top, often with political optics in mind rather than operational viability, soldiers are sent into situations where failure is not just possible, but highly probable. The 41st Army's destruction is a stark illustration of the danger of subordinating military judgment to political imperatives, and it raises questions about accountability at every level. Analysts note that when the lives of tens of thousands are treated as pawns in a broader strategic or political game, the consequences are inevitably catastrophic, both morally and practically. Internationally, the implications of such losses are impossible to ignore. Allies and adversaries are watching closely, recalculating assumptions about Russia's military capability and resilience. Each large-scale failure reinforces the perception of systemic weakness, affecting diplomatic negotiations, the flow of military aid, and the strategic calculus of neighboring states. Conversely, for Ukraine and its supporters, the collapse becomes not only a battlefield advantage, but a symbolic victory, demonstrating that even Russia's well-equipped and ostensibly disciplined forces are vulnerable when confronted by competent, coordinated resistance. The psychological impact on both soldiers and civilians is profound. Survivors from the 41st Army face the trauma of witnessing massive casualties, often without the structure or support needed to process such experiences. Families and communities grapple with the shock of sudden loss and the uncertainty of how the government will account for it. In societies where military service is intertwined with national identity and political loyalty, such failures resonate far beyond the battlefield, shaping perceptions of legitimacy, leadership, and the very purpose of the war. The human and political dimensions of the Pokrovsk collapse serve as a sobering reminder that modern warfare is never just about maps, strategy, or numbers of troops. It is about people, soldiers who fight, civilians who endure, and leaders whose decisions carry consequences measured in lives, trust, and national stability. The echoes of this loss are likely to shape Russia's military, political, and social landscape for a long time, forcing reckoning at both personal and institutional levels and challenging assumptions about the resilience of a military system under extreme pressure.